Some murders happen in a moment of rage, a fight, a betrayal, a split-second decision that changes everything. But other murders seem to unfold slowly, quietly, almost invisibly, not because the violence is hidden, because the intention is. The case of Virginia Larzelere is one of those stories. On the surface, she appeared to have built a comfortable life. She was married to a successful dentist. She helped run his practice. To outsiders, they looked like a stable, middle-class family with financial security and a future that seemed firmly established. But this was a family unraveling from the inside. A family that, according to investigators, had become entangled in deception, financial desperation, infidelity, and allegations of illegal narcotics trafficking through the very business that provided their livelihood. At the center of the case was Dr. Norman Larzelere, a husband, a father, a dentist who walked into work expecting an ordinary day and never came home. On a spring afternoon, a masked gunman entered Norman's dental office and chased him through the building before shooting him with a shotgun. Patients and employees were nearby. The attack was fast, violent, and terrifying. Norman died shortly afterward. Initially, the crime looked like a robbery gone wrong, but investigators quickly became suspicious. The story wasn't adding up, and eventually attention shifted toward the person standing closest to the victim, his wife, Virginia Larzelere. What investigators ultimately proposed was chilling, not a spontaneous killing, not an emotional explosion, but a calculated conspiracy motivated by money, control, and a belief that one life had become more valuable dead than alive. The deeper investigators dug, the more disturbing the picture became, because this case wasn't simply about financial gain. It was about what can happen when a person's need for control becomes stronger than their ability to tolerate reality, and when a spouse begins to see another human being not as a partner, but as an obstacle. Even more disturbing, it was alleged that the person who carried out the killing was Virginia's own son. The case would ultimately become one of the most shocking family murder conspiracies in Florida history. One of the most fascinating aspects of this case is that Virginia Larzelere did not fit many people's expectations of a murderer. She wasn't accused of pulling the trigger herself. Instead, prosecutors portrayed her as something even more dangerous: the architect, the planner, the person behind the scenes. Throughout the trial, prosecutors argued that Virginia had spent years building the conditions necessary for Norman's death. Evidence showed that numerous life insurance policies had been taken out on him, eventually totaling millions of dollars. Investigators believed the financial motive became impossible to ignore. Money alone, however, rarely explains human behavior. It explains incentives, not psychology. The deeper question is why someone reaches a point where murder begins to feel like a solution. Experts who study these crimes often describe a gradual process rather than a sudden transformation. People do not typically wake up one morning and decide to orchestrate a killing. Instead, they slowly shift the way they think about another person. A spouse becomes a burden. A relationship becomes a trap. Financial problems become someone else's fault. The future begins to look easier without the other person in it. And over time, empathy erodes. That erosion is often invisible. No dramatic announcement, no clear line crossed, just a series of rationalizations that grow darker with each step. In Virginia's case, prosecutors argued there were warning signs long before the murder itself. According to testimony and later reporting, both were involved in extramarital relationships. Trust had eroded. Resentment had grown. The marriage that existed publicly may have looked very different behind closed doors. Then there were the financial pressures. Despite maintaining an expensive lifestyle that included luxury purchases and significant spending, Prosecutors argued that the family's financial situation was becoming increasingly unstable. Investigators also explored allegations that narcotics were being distributed through Norman's dental practice. Those allegations painted a picture of a household operating in a world where deception had become normalized. Witnesses testified that she had allegedly approached multiple individuals about killing her husband. Some initially dismissed those statements as fantasy or exaggeration, but after Norman's death, those conversations took on a very different meaning. This is one of the most unsettling elements of many conspiracy murders. People hear disturbing comments. They assume the speaker isn't serious, because imagining that someone truly means it is uncomfortable. Most people vent. Most people fantasize. Most people never act. But occasionally, someone does. And afterward, those earlier conversations suddenly look less like jokes and more like rehearsals. Prosecutors argued that one of the most significant developments was Virginia's relationship with her son, Jason. Jason was 18 years old when Norman was killed. According to the state's theory, Virginia did not simply hire a stranger. She recruited her own son. Witnesses testified that Virginia referred to Jason as the gunman after the murder and told him, "Don't worry, you'll get your $200,000 for taking care of business." Other testimony suggested she criticized him for arriving later than planned because additional witnesses were still present in the office. If true, this transforms the case from a murder for profit into something darker. It raises questions about influence, loyalty, and manipulation. How does a parent convince a child to participate in violence? Experts who study coercive family dynamics often note that loyalty can become a powerful weapon. When approval, acceptance, or financial reward become intertwined with obedience, family relationships can take on a dangerous dimension. Jason would ultimately be acquitted of murder charges. But throughout Virginia's trial, prosecutors repeatedly argued that he had been the masked gunman who entered the dental office that afternoon. Investigators also focused on what appeared to be extensive planning. According to testimony, important documents connected to life insurance policies and wills became significant parts of the investigation. Authorities believed preparations had been occurring long before the shooting itself. Psychologically, planning changes how we understand a crime. An impulsive murder often emerges from overwhelming emotion. A planned murder emerges from repeated decisions. Each step creates another opportunity to stop, another opportunity to reconsider, another opportunity to choose a different path. The fact that those opportunities are repeatedly ignored is often what makes these cases so disturbing. Another important factor is control. Control is a recurring theme in many domestic homicide cases. Not necessarily physical control, psychological control, financial control, narrative control, the desire to dictate outcomes, to remove uncertainty, to shape the future according to one's own needs. When people become excessively invested in controlling outcomes, other human beings can begin to feel like variables that need to be managed or eliminated. Prosecutors argued that Virginia viewed Norman's death as a gateway to financial security and independence. If true, that suggests a psychological shift in which a husband ceased being a partner and became a financial asset. That kind of thinking doesn't happen overnight. It develops gradually, and by the time violence enters the picture, the emotional barriers that normally prevent harm may already have been dismantled. Perhaps the most haunting question is this: at what point did Norman stop being a person in Virginia's mind and start becoming a problem to solve? That answer died with the relationship itself, but investigators believe the process had been unfolding for years. In many true crime stories, the victim becomes a sideline in their own story. The courtroom evidence becomes the focus. The killer becomes the subject. The victim becomes a footnote. But before any of that happened, Norman Larzelere was a man living an ordinary life. He was a dentist. He treated patients. He ran a practice. He had family responsibilities and future plans. He woke up each morning assuming tomorrow would arrive, just like the rest of us. That ordinary expectation is what makes murder so devastating. The victim doesn't know they're approaching the final chapter of their story. They are thinking about appointments, bills, dinner plans, weekend projects, the countless mundane details that make up a human life. Then suddenly, all of it ends. Witnesses described a horrifying scene inside the dental office. A place associated with routine care became a crime scene. Patients and employees found themselves trapped in a nightmare they never anticipated. One of the most heartbreaking moments in the case came from testimony about Norman's final seconds. A patient present during the shooting reported hearing him say, "Jason, is that you?" Investigators considered those words deeply significant. Prosecutors believed they suggested Norman may have recognized the person behind the mask. Whether those words reflected certainty or confusion is impossible to know. But the possibility is devastating. A husband fleeing for his life. A father confronting the unimaginable possibility that someone he loved might be standing behind the weapon. For Norman's loved ones, the loss extended far beyond a single moment of violence. Murder creates a unique form of grief. Natural death allows families to mourn fate. Murder forces families to confront intention. Someone chose this. Someone decided this person should no longer exist. That reality often leaves emotional wounds that never fully heal. For the people who knew Norman, the tragedy wasn't simply that he died. It was how he died. The alleged betrayal at the center of the case transformed grief into something more complicated. Confusion, anger, disbelief, questions with no satisfying answers. How well do we truly know the people closest to us? Could warning signs have been seen earlier? Was there a moment when everything could have been prevented? Those questions often linger long after trials end. And unlike legal proceedings, they rarely receive definitive answers. Impact and analysis. As investigators examined the case, evidence continued pointing toward a murder-for-profit theory. Witness testimony, insurance records, statements made before and after the killing, and alleged efforts to conceal involvement became central components of the prosecution's case. Prosecutors argued that Virginia Larzelere orchestrated the murder to gain access to substantial insurance proceeds and assets. The trial attracted significant attention, partly because of the allegations, partly because of the family dynamics, and partly because prosecutors claimed the murder involved people who should have been able to trust one another most. A jury ultimately convicted Virginia Larzelere of first-degree murder. She was originally sentenced to death after prosecutors successfully argued the crime was motivated by financial gain and involved extensive planning. Years later, legal proceedings resulted in her death sentence being vacated, and she was resentenced to life imprisonment. The case continues to generate discussion because it challenges common assumptions about violence. Many people imagine killers as visibly dangerous, explosive, unstable, threatening. But conspiracy murders often look different. The danger isn't always emotional volatility. Sometimes the danger is patience, calculation, the ability to separate actions from empathy. One lesson often discussed by criminal behavior experts involves normalization. When someone repeatedly talks about violence, manipulates others into considering violence, or frames murder as a practical solution, those conversations should not automatically be dismissed. Most threats never become reality. But nearly every planned murder begins as an idea communicated somewhere to someone. Another important lesson involves motive. Financial motives can appear straightforward, but underneath them are often deeper psychological forces: resentment, entitlement, fear, control, the belief that one deserves a better future and that another person is standing in the way. Money may explain the reward. Psychology explains the willingness. And that's what makes cases like this so compelling and so disturbing. Because the true crime isn't just the murder, it's the transformation that made the murder possible. Conclusion and reflection. The story of Virginia Larzelere isn't merely a story about greed. It's a story about mental erosion, about what happens when empathy gradually disappears and self-interest takes its place. According to prosecutors, Norman Larzelere's death was not the result of a sudden emotional collapse. It was the outcome of choices, repeated choices, choices that ultimately ended a life and shattered countless others. Cases like this force us to confront an uncomfortable truth. The most dangerous intentions are not always loud. Sometimes they are quiet, patient, hidden beneath everyday appearances. A smiling spouse, a trusted family member, a person who seems entirely ordinary. And perhaps that's why this case continues to resonate decades later. It reminds us that human behavior is rarely as simple as it first appears. Beneath every crime lies a story. Beneath every story lies a decision. And beneath every decision lies a psychology worth understanding. Not to excuse it, not to justify it, but to recognize it before tragedy occurs. So here's the question. Do you believe financial greed was the primary force behind this crime? Or do you think the deeper motivation was something more psychological? Control, resentment, entitlement, or a desire to reshape reality on one's own terms? Let me know what you think in the comments.